Welcome to Barbara London Calling 2.0. I'm your host, Barbara London. In 1974, I founded the video media program at the Museum of Modern Art, where I was a curator for 40 years. Today, with technology as ubiquitous and as fluid as water, I'm interested in how artists adapt technology to their own artistic language and vision. In season 2 of Barbara London Calling, I'm speaking with 12 artists from all over the world, each challenging the entrenched definitions of what art is and what it can be. Welcome to Barbara London Calling 2.0. Today, my guest is Satz, an inspired artist who dives deep into the history of electronic sound. Born in Spain in 1974 and now based in London, Aura received a degree in art, music, and spectacle from the University of Bologna in 1998 and a practice/theory PhD from the Slade School of Fine Art in 2002. Aura works with the moving image and sonic sculptural objects as she creates what may appear to be minimal acoustic artwork, but in fact are packed with metaphor and original ideas. She engages with performance, film, photography, and sound installation with work that is a delightful mix of archaic technologies as she explores the complex marriage of human and machine and the uncertainty it engenders in bodily awareness and human agency. Aura, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So, Aura, I'm fascinated by how your work navigates the space between and the crossover of human and machine. It seems to me you're constantly exploring perception, the body, and the great beyond. You told me about your peripatetic childhood. I'm very curious, how did that contribute to your practice?
I'm not really sure if I could say it did in any specific way. I mean, I did travel a lot as a child, and I had a lot of visual and sensory stimuli, I guess, from many different parts of the world. I was remembering the other day that I had some very strange formative acoustic experiences as a child. I had multiple ear infections, and I used to hear my heart amplified really, really loud. And I visualized it as a kind of monster that was coming after me. And other times I'd hear things as if they were replayed really slowed down. And I wonder whether those little moments of doubt around what I was hearing, whether it's inside, whether it's outside, whether it's in sync with reality, maybe those were informative. I don't know. I haven't fleshed it out yet. This is just something I'm thinking out loud with you. But I mean, maybe that was more central to my interest in a kind of slipperiness around embodied experience and objectivity and the sensory interface with the world. Maybe that was more formative than some of the other things that happened in my crazy hippie childhood.
That's great. So moving from childhood, you began your career making sculpture and photographs, doing performance, and making films using archival footage of magicians. So I'm curious, why does the idea of misdirection interest you?
In some ways, maybe that follows on from what I was describing earlier, where something in the lived experience of reality doesn't quite fit. And if you think of film and sync sound, when things are out of sync or when you're watching a film that's been dubbed, there's also a kind of interesting mismatch between, or misdirection between what you're hearing and what you're seeing. And I find that space really generative because on the one hand, you go with it. So whatever sound you play over a video, it kind of starts to articulate it and give it shape somehow, compose it. It might stretch it upwards or make you look a certain way, focally or, in a kind of more gestalt way. And so there's something about a kind of friction between sound and image when they fit maybe all too well or when they don't fit, that does something perceptually and cognitively that I'm interested in pushing and testing and going elsewhere with that. And I think in some ways it might have started in the work I did around magic. But when I made a piece with the filmmaker, I collaborated with Liz Rhodes, and I made a film with the optical sound recorder of a 16mm camera. That really hit home for me because I'd been making all of these works that were visualizations of sound or sonifications of the visual, and suddenly something else was happening when there was a slippage. And when the illusion didn't quite work, it wasn't seamless. I guess it was an attempt to also make the audience work a bit harder, make the people, visually, sonically reading the experience have to kind of latch the image to the sound in a very different way. So I keep being surprised and I guess experiencing levels of wonderment when I test different things in this way, because it takes me both deeply into my body and totally outside of it. It makes the boundaries of self and not self porous. And that has all kinds of other implications, not just on a kind of physical level, not just in terms of one's perception, but, it's conceptual and philosophical and ideological as well.
So that leads wonderfully into my next question. We could say that there are two major strands to your work. One is music, sound, technology, vibration, and acoustics. The other has to do more with gender and the contributions women have made to new technologies. And I understand you began working with sound in 2002 when you were pregnant and you were using your belly as a kind of instrument. The resulting artwork was ventriloquy. So the pregnant you became a musical instrument, a channeling device. Could you tell me something about how you connected ventriloquism to the very mysterious theremin instrument?
So first and foremost, for those who aren't familiar with the theremin, it's an instrument you play without touching. So unlike the piano where you have a keyboard, the theremin, it's an electromagnetic field and you move your hands near a rod, as it were, and you kind of have to find the pitch. And then whatever your starting point is, you build up the kind of keyboard equivalent in this way. So that in itself was interesting to me because, again, there's a very intuitive bodily way of interacting with something that is invisible and that suggests hand gestures and sign language and a whole range of kind of other linguistic forms that aren't, voice or writing or even musical notation. So I've done a lot of works with the theremin, and that's why I find it really fascinating. When I was pregnant, I had this really powerful experience of understanding myself as a vessel or a container for another voice. And when I was talking earlier about this porosity between inside and out, between self and non-self, this was this really strange possession, but not in the kind of horror film way, but like I literally, as anyone who was pregnant knows, like I had another body inside of me. But what was interesting was to try and imagine what this voice might be, and not to think of it in terms of being this mother figure or some kind of primal yeah, it wasn't really about procreation as much as it was about this notion of like having other voices inside of me. And the ventriloquist dummy is precisely that. It's a trick, a misdirection of voice through a dummy, through a kind of doll of sorts. But also, I mean, originally throwing one's voice wasn't necessarily even connected to an object. It could have just been that you threw it in a room in such a way that it didn't seem to be coming from you. And so that slippery sense of where the voice sits, which is ultimately, acoustically, that's already how sound operates. It's already, inside of me, emanating from my body, but it's also hitting the walls, absorbing the acoustics of the room, going through a sound recording device or telephone, telepresencing elsewhere. So there's lots of ways in which the voice is already doing that. But it seemed to me particularly interesting at that point in time. There was an alignment of, that I literally had this other voice inside of me, and I was a kind of antenna that could be tuned into to manifest it, to bring it into speech. And the sounds it made through the theremin were very otherworldly. Again, the theremin to me suggests this notion of a possible language that doesn't completely resolve itself as language, and that's how it sounded, as if the unborn child, which also looked like a kind of swollen eye or orange or something quite surreal, that it was communicating something, but we didn't know what. And that seemed very poetic and powerful to me.
So in 2008, you made a film about mechanical music, and that was a moment when you moved away from sculpture and performance, and you prioritized filmmaking. And to 2010, you made a film about phonograph grooves, and you continued this really strong interest in sound. So I'd like to know more about what drew you to older technologies.
Yeah, I mean, I was really interested in obsolete technology. And nowadays, even though I'm working on a project that I thought wasn't about obsolete technology, there's always that, the threat of obsolescence is kind of always, especially with the rhythm of technology nowadays, it's kind of always lurking in the background. And what's interesting about it to me is manifold. I guess on the one hand, it's the moment in which something is invented and it changes our understanding of a kind of paradigm. So the phonograph and mechanical music are the kind of first instances of the possibility of playback, of something being played back from, in the case of mechanical music, played back from the code, so from the equivalent of notation in mechanical form, which is essentially binary code and leads us to computers later on through the Jacquard loom. But also the phonograph groove is a similar kind of playback of recorded voice or recorded music. And it produces a kind of writing that can't be read by human eyes. It can only be played back by the machine. So it's a kind of one-way type of writing. So maybe to kind of reiterate what I was saying earlier about forms of language or communication that suggest a system or a code of sorts, but that aren't completely accessible to us or decipherable, that is interesting to me because it opens up a space for possibility, for a kind of fresh, nuanced, unusual encounter. And I was, I guess, trying to think back to those initial moments when people encountered mechanical music. What did they think? How did they experience that instrument sculpturally, performatively, in terms of a form of writing and reading back? In terms of, for example, what I was saying earlier around the voice being displaced, in that case, not kind of telepresenced far away, but actually displaced in time, so kind of time traveling through voice. And all of that, again, was an interesting way of breaking down the interfaces, the technologies, the prosthetic tools we have around us that help us interface with otherness. And so those projects were really formative. I guess the bit that I've left behind is a historicizing approach. I'm less interested in that now for multiple reasons. But at the time, I guess, because I was interested in rewriting and playback and memory and a kind of recovery of sorts, and certainly the works I did around women and electronic music were partly about that as well, kind of looking at pockets of history that maybe hadn't been heard, seen in that way. I'm still really invested in that, and it's really important to me on many fronts. But I guess I've moved away from a historiographic approach because I feel that the projects I'm working on right now need to face forward. And a lot of what I'm doing is around retuning. So when I was talking about the theremin project, that's why I love that instrument, because each time you have to kind of tune yourself to the instrument afresh. And so an attempt to retune and recalibrate and kind of position yourself in relation to the conditions of the world seems really key. And that's a kind of survival mechanism, survival strategy of sorts that I'm really committed to in my practice now. So yeah, a few things have changed. There's a lot of continuity. There's a lot of things that I carry forward, but I suppose I'm less interested in looking at technologies that have been forgotten in the way that I was at that point in time.
So maybe just to say a few words about the work that did look at the old technology. One was a film installation, Doorway, for Natalie Kalmus. And I don't think many people know who that is. And that work of yours looks at the analog color grading machine and the mechanics of its lenses, mirrors, and color filters. So Natalie Kalmus was married to Herbert Kalmus, the inventor of Technicolor. And I love the idea that she herself worked with color as if she were composing music.
Yeah, I mean, I was really interested in the color lamp house. I came across it while I was making the film about optical sound on film. And it's a really beautiful, tiny pocket, as it were, in the machine where you originally would have graded a film. And interestingly enough, as I said, there are so many strange lines of continuity. In the one that I shot, the code was kind of binary code, so it looked like pianola music, perforated paper. And so when I shot that film, we actually composed a sequence to sound a certain rhythm in the way that the portals, the little doors in the device that allow a certain amount of RGB, of red, green, and blue, to expose the film and grade it. So we composed it in a kind of musical way. But when I was researching that project, and as I said, it has these three little doors and multiple lenses and mirrors and prisms. So it's really stunning. But when I composed it, I really loved this idea of the door or the portal. And a lot of my works, I realized most recently, have in their titles or make reference to this notion of a door or a doorway or a portal. And I've always thought of them as portals. So even, when I was talking earlier about voice, my mouth, like that's a portal of sorts from the inside to the outside. But the way that Natalie Kalmus composed for film was, she was given a script. And I don't know, she did many, many like really famous Technicolor films, Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz, many, many, many. And she was not very famous. I think she's only maybe been given credit more recently. And I wasn't able to find any of her color scores, which I was desperate to see because I was kind of drawing a slightly bizarre lineage with her work and Paul Sharratz's films. And some of the visuals of my film were kind of referencing his work with color and after image in that way. But she had also had a kind of life-changing experience where she communicated with people on their deathbed, in particular his sister. And so I came across an article she wrote, and I had to have to look through my notes to make sure I'm quoting it properly, but I think it was called Doorway Onto Another World. And so I thought that was really evocative of this notion of the doorway and the color, and that, the doorway is for her, and it's kind of almost like a ghosting of her thinking around color and this process in relation to film. And yeah, when I was talking about the color code, so she would think of the narrative in terms of a color spectrum. So what should the actress wear, and what should the backdrop be, and what color should the curtains be, and really thinking around narrative to draw out this kind of chromatic quality that wasn't quite abstract in the way that, structuralist film was later. But there's something really fascinating to me going back to this idea of notation and scores that are suggestive of some sense of musicality, even if they aren't at all, which I imagine hers were.
I love how you, with your work, Impulsive Synchronization of 2013, were inspired by Hedy Lamarr, who's known as a very famous actress from the 30s and the 40s, but during World War II, she had emigrated from Germany to America and met the composer George Antheil. and he was a bad boy of American music. And he had been experimenting with the pianola, a self-playing piano that contained a pneumatic or an electronic mechanism that operated the piano action via program music recorded on perforated paper. But together, Antheil and Lamar came up with the idea, which they called frequency hopping. And they patented that in 1941. And of course, about getting information across secretly was used by the Americans during the war. So could you explain what frequency hopping is? And how did your interest in Lamar lead to your investigation into women and computing?
Yeah, so that was one of those projects where the backstory was too dense and incredible. In fact, after I made that project, there was a documentary about her that came out not too long ago. It's an incredible, incredible story. She had been married to an arms dealer in Germany, and she'd sat at the table with Hitler and Mussolini. And so she actually, had this engineer's or inventor's brain. She was super smart, and she came up with quite a few ideas that I don't think ever got patented in the same way. One was like a bouillon for Coca-Cola. Another was some kind of facelift accordion device, a traffic light system. But for this project, America was at war, and they solicited inventions from the general population. And Georges Antheil had been making music with mechanical pianolas, and also kind of the sounds of war and, kind of industrial sounds, a bit like the futurists. And so together they came up with this idea, which is based on the pianola perforated paper principle, that there would be two devices that would be hopping between frequencies like the perforations on pianola paper, and they would communicate to each other remotely, and therefore it would kind of jam the signal for the enemy. And if I'm not mistaken, actually they did have it patented in 1941, but it wasn't used in World War II, and instead it was used during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But then the fascinating thing is that technology, that patent, morphed into, or kind of found a lineage somehow through to becoming the basis for Wi-Fi and broadband. And so actually Hedy Lamarr is considered the kind of godmother of wireless telephony. And, I did make a project the year after that was around women and telephones. And so that's what I meant around things kind of not being that linear. They're often constellations. And actually the project I had made around Daphne Oram in 2011 preceded this project. The research I'd been doing around optical sound on film had led to composition using visuals through film to produce a synthetic sound, or a sound that is not pre-recorded, a sound that comes from a drawing or from the visual and is sonified. And Daphne Oram was the kind of pioneer of this, making this really incredible machine that she also patented called the Aramix machine. What I was interested in all of these projects really around women and technology is this notion of kind of authoring a new language, a new code. So Hedy Lamarr with Georges Antheil, it wasn't just her on her own, but they kind of devised a new secret communication system, which, even if it wasn't used at the time, kind of had this really interesting other legacy, which connects to the kind of ventriloquist trope I was talking about earlier on, around a kind of distribution of like disembodied voices, which is where we're at now and what we're doing right now in this moment across the sea. But with the Aramix machine, similarly, she devised a whole new notation system, a whole new visual form of sound writing. And the sounds that resulted from this machine also sounded very otherworldly. So initially they were used, much like the theremin, either for horror film or for kind of sci-fi. So either the totally abject, bodiless, this notion of like, you don't even know what a body that makes that sound could look like. So often, she made soundtracks to horror films. This is Daphne Oram made the soundtrack to a film called The Innocents, and it's what's outside, what's lurking outside the window that is a kind of ghostly presence that we don't know what the body of that sound might be. But equally, in relation to sci-fi, it's like the kind of potential future, or the alien, or the not from this world. And often I have inhabited that sonic realm. And I think it is maybe connected to this notion of, on the one hand, it's a kind of haunting both of the past and of the future potentially, but also the thing that doesn't have a clearly defined boundary, a clearly defined body, a clearly defined sense of where it sits, who it is, who it's for, who's being communicated with. I like those kind of sounds. And just to rewind a moment to the Hedy Lamarr project, so I kind of took this idea of encryption quite far, and I used a section of the text of the patent, which defined the secret communication text, and I turned it into Morse code. And then I watched many, many Hedy Lamarr films, and I found one which she did with Jimmy Stewart, in which she used a flashlight, and the metaphor was, fireflies communicating. And so she's just there with a flashlight communicating to him, in a romantic comedy of sorts. But I just had that one still of her kind of pulsing, coming back and forth according to the Morse code. And it was projected onto a screen made out of multiple pianola rolls, which had Georges Hantel's score printed or perforated onto it. So what was interesting is because the scroll was slowly moving, that when the light hit through, you got these kind of little twinkling moments of kind of interference or light patterns. I mean, I really enjoyed researching that project. I really feel that the story was much bigger than what I could do with it.
That's fascinating. And I loved the idea of Lamarr. She's, such a cinematic icon. So your interest in sound and the otherworldly brings us to your work, The Dial Tone Drone. And it's, to me, a very brilliantly concise work that I'm very happy to say is in the Cadiz Foundation's collection. And it's also featured in my Seeing Sound exhibition, which is circulated by Independent Curators International. So I'll just give a little description. So when Dial Tone Drone is installed, the visitor is invited to pick up the vintage telephone handset, or they can call the number provided from their own smartphone. Then they sit down and they listen to a pre-recorded conversation between two old friends, the respected electronic music pioneers Pauline Oliveros and Laurie Spiegel. So the pair very congenially discuss drones, or the use of sustained notes, sounds, or tone clusters in music, and the use of drones in the composer's own music. So these two friends very eloquently get into the nitty-gritty of how the telephone dial tone drone is simply an indication of the potential for communication.
What does it mean to be connected? That's a good question. The first thing that comes to my mind is how tenuous connectedness is, how fragile, how easily connections are broken, whether they're electronic or emotional or in any other way. And there's also the fact that many connections are brief, transitory, and not very deep. So I think of connection as a state of vulnerability.
So I know that you have a longstanding interest in alert signals. So do you want to give me a little backstory to the dial tone drone?
So after I made the project around Hedy Lamarr, and as I said, that kind of pointed already in the direction of telephony, I was really interested in the role of women with early media. So they're kind of, I guess, their enmeshment with these kind of new technologies of tele something or other. So whether it's telephony or telegraphy, I guess typing is not a tele in the same way, but this notion of like forms of inscription and recording and broadcast or dissemination. And as women were joining the workforce, often it was as telephone operators or typists and so forth. And so they were the conduits rather than the kind of authors necessarily. In fact, I think telephone operators were called speech weavers, and that's such a beautiful image in itself. So I made a couple of works around the telephone, and I have done, even in lockdown, I made a new one quite recently. And what interested me about this is the notion of, well, as I said earlier, kind of telepresence and like projecting one's voice, but also connecting voices so that these multiple diverse voices are somehow, for a moment, part of the same circuit board. And while I was making this piece that was more historical around telephone operators, I was really keen to work with Laurie and Pauline for different reasons. Laurie, as you know, was artist in residence at the Bell Telephone Labs and did a lot of her most important work there. And Pauline had been working with telepresence for a long time, way up to kind of, when Skype was born. So there were all of these works that were about kind of pushing the boundaries of where the performance takes place and who with and how we communicate across and with. And they both have worked sometimes with, more explicit kind of drone, as in the case of Pauline's work. I think Laurie wouldn't necessarily define her work as drone in that way because, a drone, as she says in the piece, a drone isn't kind of static. So you might hear it initially as static, but what happens perceptually, and this is why it's interesting to me, is that as you're listening, your mind adjusts and then you kind of start to go deeper. So it's like when you look through a magnifying lens or something, you start to see more detail. So you start to hear a wider bandwidth of sound. And within that, you start to either kind of, depending on the nature of the sustained note that you're listening to, either your mind will imagine kind of smaller patterns within it so that you can perceive change, maybe where there's very little change, or depending on the sound that is kind of played in this way, you might actually start to delve into its textures and the kind of intricacies and the filigree almost of what's in that sound. And so I aspire to and am inspired by this notion of close listening, or as Pauline would call it, deep listening, and a kind of attention to both having ears or, hearing through vibration if you have a kind of neurodiverse or oral diverse ways of listening. I like that idea of really becoming aware of having a body that is experiencing some kind of sonic or vibratory input, and at the same time of kind of paying attention or yielding your attention, surrendering to that sound. And the dial tone is in part that, if you listen to it, although nowadays we don't have it in the same way that we did, prior to kind of smartphones, etc. But, a landline would have had a tone. And that tone is basically the equivalent of the female telephone operator's voice saying, "What number, please?" That tone is saying, "The line is open. Who can I connect you to?" So it's the space of possibility of connection. And I thought that was really poetic. And as I said, both Pauline Oliveros and Laurie Spiegel had kind of reasons to be somehow aligned with the history of telephony, but rather than thinking of them as telephone operators or as, speech weavers, they authored, they coded or programmed a whole new way of producing sound, and with that of listening to the sounds that they composed. And it was a really beautiful experience. I feel incredibly privileged to have made that piece with them and to have met them through making that work. And since then, in particular with Laurie, I've made other projects as well. The reason I like alert sounds is because they are, in some ways, they're prompts. So they're not quite sounds, they're not quite music. They're a kind of semantic code. They are a code. So the telephone, the busy line is a code that's saying that person's not available now. And the kind of alerts that I'm looking at now with my project on sirens are calls to attention in a similar way. They're a kind of code that we've learned, that we've been taught to listen to a certain way and then take certain actions or preemptive measures in the case of a siren. And I'm interested in trying to open that up and make us question that code, listen to it differently. And I think what happens in dial tone drone is that you listen and you dip in and out of the experience of listening and then being guided or kind of, you have a kind of insight into their way of listening. So you're both your own ears while you listen, but then through what they're saying, you are partly kind of under the skin or under the eardrum or whatever the expression would be. You're kind of inside their listening as well.
So that is a wonderful way to now go into today, how smartphones tend to provide a soundtrack for our lives. As I walk down a New York City street, I always see people with earbuds on, and they're very engrossed, or in what they're doing with their phone. And in a way, then we become kind of unaware of what sounds we pay attention to and then what we ignore. It seems that how an individual internally recalibrates and adjusts appears to be one of your guiding principles. So how does that play into your very new project? It will be your first feature film and a very complex and amazing research project called Preemptive Listening. Can you talk about it?
It's all I talk about at the moment. I'm compulsively obsessed with it, and it's been several years in the making or in the thinking. I've done smaller iterations of it. It is a strategy for surviving as much as anything. And it is about recalibrating what we pay attention to, what is worthy of attention, what we understand as an emergency. Yeah, what we deem kind of worthy of, whether we want to call it preemptive action or some kind of rescue or some kind of help. I do feel the crisis we're experiencing now, which is both a crisis of attention, in the sense that, as you said, with regards to smartphones, the world is cacophonous, it's overwhelming, there's a kind of constant, relentless sensory input, and it's distracting. And so within this crisis of our attention, there is also a kind of state of emergency. We're all feeling it very intuitively. We feel like we're in a state of hypervigilant kind of alert, and yet it's completely paralyzing. And so whether it's climate change or other forms, we're in the middle of a pandemic still, although we're pretending we're not. The refugee crisis, there are so many things that are kind of calling for our attention, and that it's very hard to know how to kind of navigate it, how to listen properly. And so the project is in many ways trying to address this, trying to reframe what we understand as emergency from the kind of immediate time frame. So fire is a good example. There's smoke, and then there's fire alarm, and then hopefully people put out the fire and go to the rescue. But right now, after this summer in particular, but it's been in the making for a very long time, multiple fires are indicating something very different beyond the kind of immediate emergency framework. And so climate change, the slow violence and the systemic kind of violence of climate catastrophe, how do we reframe that? How do we understand that? And the siren is a portal or a way in, a metaphor to start thinking around that.
That is the sound which I remember it with. And of course, as I return to it, it does become the siren in the other sense. Not so much the calling you to disaster, as much as it's a sound I don't want to forget. Because it helps me find my way. If I'm to locate a fork in the road of where things could have gone and where they went, it would be then.
But the key element of the project, beyond the kind of diagnosis of where we're at in terms of emergency more generally and our attention, our capacity for attention, is to try and recompose the siren. So a bit like the dial tone, where I was kind of taking this prompt, this notion of a kind of sustained note that communicates a signal of sorts, of the possibility of communication. Here I'm taking another familiar signal, which is a call to attention and then some kind of instruction into action, and trying to recompose it and think what might happen if we do that, both in very grounded terms. So what would an alternative siren sound like? because the ones we have now, we're not hearing them properly. They're loud, they're competing, they're blaring. Everything is beeping from our microwaves to our seatbelts. So not just kind of sirens and emergency vehicles. But, there are other ways in which just thinking speculatively, imaginatively, poetically around the siren and trying to reinvent it might open up to alternative future possibilities, alternative ways of crisis management. And that's really where I want the project to go. That's why I was saying earlier on that I'm less interested in looking back and more interested in facing forward. And this project allows me to do that, and I'm doing it collectively. I've invited many different people to collaborate with me, musicians to compose new sirens. I'm consulting with lots of different people who have different areas of specialization to see if I can somehow forge a new tentative understanding of emergency signals, and within that, the kind of ways in which we understand and deal with emergency more generally. So that's where it's at. It's hugely ambitious. It's a giant leap for me in my practice. It's very all-consuming. And I think every time I speak to someone about it, everyone has a very personal experience of some emergency sound of sorts. And sometimes it's a trigger, sometimes it's a commemorative sound. If you think of, I think China early on in the pandemic, they played a siren as a kind of commemorative pause, and it's used similarly for Holocaust Remembrance Day. So there's all these ways in which the siren is also not just an emergency, a future-facing emergency, but it's also this kind of trigger or moment of collective silence.
Well, that's great. You're preemptive listening in a way, a project you're very deeply in the middle of. Perhaps leads into now my very last question. This is the question I'm asking each of my guests, and that is, given the ups and downs of the past 18 months and the struggles we've all faced in trying to adapt, how has technology affected you and your practice in the last year and a half?
So I've kind of come, I don't know if full circle is the word, but I was invited to make another piece connected to telephony. And obviously we were all glued to our phones during the pandemic. My family all live abroad, so I was speaking to them every day. And I had really wanted to reach out to Eliane Radig, a French composer who works with really beautiful iridescent drones. Well, she used to work with kind of more electronic music, and in the last 20 years she's made acoustic works with musicians. And she transmits the score to them through a conversation. And the score is an image of water. It's not even a specific image. It might be Lake Geneva or something. So together with her and two of her long-term collaborators, Rodri Davis and Julia Eckhart, we made a piece that used similar principles to dial tone drone, but it was about transmission, and about the transmission of a score, and about the experience of listening to it and thinking, as a musician, as a composer who was transmitting a score and then hearing it come back to her. So that was a really beautiful experience last year that was done remotely, obviously. And then this year, connected to the Siren Project, I actually just did a shoot in Fukushima just last month, where I had someone be my kind of avatar. And I did all of the preliminary research online, Google Maps, people who knew the lay of the land, who'd done projects in Fukushima or were from Fukushima. So that was really fascinating, really surreal. The shoot lasted all night, so I was up from like 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. because of the time zone. And it really gave me some insights into a kind of, I guess it's a COVID-friendly workflow, but it's also a CO2 emissions-friendly workflow, in that I don't necessarily have to go everywhere to shoot. And because this project is international in scope, this is a really good way of making bits of it with people who are local to the site. And yeah, it's been really, really fascinating, really rewarding. We've also shot some footage in America, and we'll be shooting some more. And as we move forward, it becomes clearer which things I really have to go to in person and which ones don't really require all of that infrastructure and funding and kind of costs. So that's been really interesting. And as I said, the Siren Project has been all-consuming for a while now, but with the pandemic, it's ringing out really loud in my head relentlessly in a positively compulsive way. So I've made a lot of progress with that project, a lot of deep research. So it's been, in a strange way, it's been good. Not in every way, but certainly in terms of my creative practice and my creative workflow, it's been useful.
I'm very happy to know that there's a positive aspect to the last year for you. So thank you so much for joining me. It's been great to be with you, even though we're remote in different parts of the world. It's very special.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Support for Barbara London Calling 2.0 is generously provided by the Kramlich Art Foundation. The series is produced by Ryan Leahy and production assistant Vuk Vukovic. Be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify so you can keep up to date with new episodes in the series. Follow us on Instagram at Barbara London Calling and check out my website, barbaralondon.net, for transcripts and links to the works discussed. Special thanks to Lee Ronaldo for graciously providing our music, and to Independent Curators International for their help with the series. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.